Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and as somebody who loves brewing decks, I have brewed a lot of decks over the years. A lot of those ideas have never even seen the light of day. Decks that just kind of sit on a Brews folder on my Moxfield account, and I don't really mean even decks that I've built and then later retired and took apart or decks that I built for a single episode and then never really got around to papering out. I mean decks which, for one reason or another, failed to live up to my expectations. I want to talk about these failures, and I want to shout out all of the brewers out there, whether you brew for cEDH or any other brackets. We know it's not easy. In fact, I would love to hear about your brews that didn't quite make the cut for you down in the comments on YouTube. And a great place to hear about brews is on the CCO Discord, which you can get on if you are part of the Commander Cookout Patreon here on Commander Cookout Media Group. And in addition to talking about all the regular casual brews that I know that Ryan and Brando love on CCO Podcast, we also have an entire channel just for cEDH and competitive decks. Be sure to check it out if you can get it on the Patreon. Now, there are 3 basic steps in building a new Commander deck. I break them down as inspiration, construction, and testing. Inspiration is just when the basic framework is just the thing, just the thought, whereas construction is when you're actually trying to put together a functional deck list, and testing is where you have a functional deck list that you're putting through its initial paces. And a brew can fall apart in any step of this process. Whether it's a new legend showing up in a spoiler, a pull from a draft that really sparks an idea, or a build for another format that does something intriguing to you, the inspiration of the deck is the part that just kind of lives in your head. You can see how this commander works with that card. You can understand how the basic game plan might work. You might be able to hold 7, maybe 10 cards in your mind while you're plotting out that deck. For me, the key is often usually some major interaction or thought experiment that I'm building around my head when I'm working on this deck. If it's a cEDH list, for example, you may be just intending to fill out the rest of the list with the traditional staples. If you want your deck to survive this phase, far and away, the most important thing that you can do is to write your deck idea down. Even if you're a diehard cardboard and long boxes on the kitchen table sort of player, having a deck on Moxfield or Architect, just to enter a handful of cards into a deck list, can be a great springboard for you to go back and refer to that core later on. If not, consider writing things down in a note-taking app, or writing it down on pen and paper the old-fashioned way. If you already have easy access to your collection all the time, just pull out those core cards. I hesitate to say fold the cards you want into your shopping cart, even from today's sponsor, FusionGamingOnline.com, where you can use the promo code on your screen or in the description to save some cash. But it is a place where you can save money on the cards you're thinking about when you don't necessarily have the chance to give the brew your full attention. At the very least, if you do like what I occasionally do a couple of times and order duplicates of a card for your deck, you will save some money on that card. And that's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. The other way I find that decks tend to fall apart in the inspiration phase is when a card doesn't quite work the way you thought it worked. Miri, Weatherlight Duelist, was originally going to be the commander for my Super Friends deck I had a great idea for. Until I reread the card and realized that Miri only protected you from being attacked by one or more creature, not your planeswalkers. Doesn't do a lot of good in planeswalker deck, frankly. A good way to speed through this part of the process is to ask a judge or ask a friend if a card does just seem too good to be true. And honestly, just read the card out loud, as we tend to gloss over a lot of text when we are reading cards in our heads. When you catch your own errors more quickly this way, you can move on more quickly to the next brew you have in mind. Finally, I find that sometimes my biggest inspirations are looking at lists that other people have put together and then iterating on those. Even if they felt like the list never quite came together or kind of dismissed it during one of their own pieces of content. Which is why part of the reason why I leave so many unfinished decks in my brews folder on Moxfield. They're there to inspire me again later, or hopefully to inspire another brewer to find that list that never really came together for me. The next phase is the construction phase, the hard part of actually putting the deck together, whether it's on the floor or at the table with your long box, or with Scryfall searches and Moxfield entries. This is often the most difficult part of the process. Personally, I really like to build up the core identity of my deck during this phase, the cards which directly contribute to the game plan I want for my deck. This may be a core combo like my Vol cEDH deck, where I did Scryfall searches for permanents with activated abilities that could untap my commander for less mana than I generate by tapping Vol. The deck's main game plan, like getting tons of artifacts into play as early as possible to feed one of my personal favorites, Nissa of Traken. This step for me usually comes down to Scryfall searches after Scryfall searches, which, fun fact, you can actually perform using the search feature in Moxfield if you build on the website. You simply go to the search bar and you can enter Scryfall query terms, which if you're savvy could be something like putting T: with creature if you're going to be searching for creatures, or O: with a particular keyword that you're going to search for using the Oracle text on a card. This could also be the phase where if you are prone to using EDH Rec, you might search for your commander or your deck archetype to look for some ideas in your color identity or with your commander that you may have missed in your first draft. The first place where a brew might fall apart in this stage is if you can't find enough redundancy of a particular effect that your deck wants, such as trying to brew an energy deck before Modern Horizons 3 and Aftershift came out, or I guess Fallout as well. If you're looking at a really niche creature type, you might also find very few playable cards. As much as I would love to see some cEDH birds decks, I don't think it's happening anytime soon. Or, for example, if you're building around a particular color pie bend or break, like maybe Rakdos Enchantress, you might have a difficult time making that work. The magic number that I have found for redundant effects is usually about 8 to make a particular effect consistent to find. You don't have that, and you may want to potentially shift that into the command zone if possible, just for that reliability. It's still not always easy, but once you can get up to 8 copies of a particular effect, you can usually make it work in Commander. My usual roadblock at this step is that I tend to get bored when I get to the point of actually putting in the staple cards and effects. So I try to take advantage of packages on Moxfield to smooth out that part of the process. We talked about those in a recent episode as well. Now, a lot of brewers also spend some time getting stuck on making cuts to a deck, especially if you're the kind of person who just throws 120 cards or 150 cards or, God help you, 200 cards into a list before you start adding your lands or your all-important interaction suite. Basically, no matter what it is for you, that tedious part of the process when you're no longer working on the fun core of your deck that initially sparked your joy during the inspiration phase, that's the piece where a lot of people tend to fall apart during the construction phase, and a lot of decks never wind up seeing the light of day. Actually papering the list out is also a major hurdle that many people who, like me, brew on digital platforms first, tend to struggle with. Finding cards, buying missing cards, sleeving up a new deck, all of those things take time. You can save time on this where possible by keeping your cards relatively well organized. I personally try to organize by color identity and then alphabetical order, and to save a little time, I try to make sure my cards are always stored with inner sleeves and then keeping them in penny sleeves just makes it easier to get them physically in and out of the boxes and easier to start sleeving up right away if I don't have to also inner sleeve all the decks. Possibly the most frustrating time for a deck to fail is when you are assembling the deck and you go to start testing it. For my process, I'll generally goldfish a deck a few dozen opening hands. cEDH brews in particular may live or die based entirely on how well or how poorly they mulligan. It's generally time for major tweaks to a cEDH brew if it doesn't present very many keepable opening hands, and even if the deck has good opening hands, if it's too slow to really do the thing, well, that's another red flag. I can usually feel fairly confident that this iteration of a brew won't make it as a cEDH deck. My cutoff there is if I'm still spinning my wheels on like turns 4 or 5 without a clear path to victory, it's almost definitely not going to work, especially if it's offering me very few options to interact with my opponents. On the other hand, if I'm satisfied with goldfishing and excited enough to sleeve up the deck, I'll bring it to some test games and let people know that I am testing a new deck. In cEDH pods, it's not uncommon for players to help one another by practicing and identifying their lines, as well as maybe even giving some feedback on card selection. At any pod, I like to keep a running tally of cards that underperform or cards that rot in my hand. And I've actually started carrying a physical notebook everywhere with me, as I find this little guy can be really useful to jot down how certain cards play during gameplay. And taking those notes of things that I might forget once I'm away from the table, well, I got it written down, I'm all set. Outside of cEDH, I have a lot of decks which just don't survive the first few games, where I find fundamental flaws in their performance or a gameplay style that I just don't enjoy. The latter would be something like +1/+1 counter decks, which I always love in theory, but tend not to last very long for me physically because manipulating a bunch of counters or dice just isn't very fun. Now, on a single creature or a very small number of creatures, sure, but there's a reason why I haven't played Cathar's Crusade in years. I don't want to fiddle around with all of those counters, no matter how powerful the effect may be. I've also found that for me, decks reliant on a high mana value commander to really get going tend to fall apart pretty quickly too. I find those decks usually only really work when the commander's powerful effect lets me turn the corner from an already compelling early game plan. The best way to salvage a brew at this point is to try to interrogate if it's not performing the way you want it to. You can see how I approached this with my Trelasara deck in the episode Interrogating Soul Sisters. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, I have a lot of brews which will never see the light of day. And I feel like this medium of YouTube or audio podcast, however you're enjoying this episode, and in fact, most forms of content creation in the Magic ecosystem kind of gloss over this part of the creative process. As a creator, I can just choose to present a completed deck list that does what I think it needs to do, something new or interesting, or something that I think will just get clicks. I don't have to show you the dozens of failed brews that I tried to put together in the hopes of making something really interesting that just fell short by being a little too slow for cEDH, or just not being fun for casual tables, or having some fundamental flaw that I overlooked. But personally, for me, they're all there on Moxfield. And many of those failures went on to inspire later brews, and continue to inspire new brews all the time. One of my favorite decks from the last few years, my Teamer Nissa of Traken deck, came out of my Jeskai Nissa of Traken deck that I made for cEDH Brew that was really fun, but never quite clicked the way I wanted it to. And I think that my dreams of making an Osier and Oxel brew work in cEDH are probably instead going to turn into a very fun-looking Gruul casual deck, which uses that Ixalan god as a hidden commander instead. I also think I've brewed maybe a half a dozen different decks inspired by Up the Beanstalk style decks in Modern, and not one of them is ready for prime time yet. But I feel like I'm getting closer each time I iterate on it. One day, I'm pretty confident that I will find a way to scratch those particular itches. But that's my process. That's how I approach building and brewing decks. And I love brewing decks. But I would be a bold-faced liar if I told you that every single one I bring into the world springs forth perfectly conceived. Most of them are a mess. But when you get used to the process, you learn to fail faster and brew much more interesting decks as a result. Don't just give up on your failures. There's always something to learn from them. You can tell us about it if you reach out to us on Blue Sky, where we are at GemstoneMineMTG. You can send us an email to gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. And of course, we are here on YouTube as part of Commander Cookout Media Group. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.